and welcome to Haunted Hotels with Sam Baltrusis. I'm, of course, Sam Baltrusis, and we are going to one of my favorite locations, Salem, Massachusetts. Going with me on this journey is my good friend and High Priestess, Dana Masson. Welcome to the show, Dana.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dana, our backstory is kind of crazy, actually. We met on one of my tours in Salem, Massachusetts. Tell our listeners how we met.
Well, the High Priestess of the coven that I belong to, she has a meetup group, and so she often sets up meetups in Salem and other places around Massachusetts of interest to pagan, like-minded folks, and she set up this trip to Salem, and she got you to be the tour guide. And I remember seeing the post for that, and I was like, ooh, Sam Baltrusis. I really like his books because I was already friends with Joni. And, she talked about you a lot, and I was reading her books and your books, and I said, oh, wow, I definitely want to go to this tour because then I would get to, meet and talk to Sam. And I went and we met and talked, but there were some things that happened that day that really kind of made us go, what's going on here? There's something going on. There's some strange connection happening.
There was, and I have my dowsing rods, which are charged by a high priestess, and I asked the group because I had this weird sensation that somehow someone in the group had ties to the victims of the Salem witch trials. And meanwhile, I go, point to the person that may be related to one of the victims of the Salem witch trials, and of course it goes to you. And I'm like, Dina, are you actually related to anybody from the Salem witch trials? And you're like, not that I know of. And thus began our friendship and trying to uncover the mysteries of our lineage. It turns out about a year after that, I'm related to the Putnam family, which makes complete sense now that I've given tours in Salem for about 10 years. And you're related to
Elizabeth Howe.
Yeah. And that Elizabeth Howe was one of the 20 victims who were executed in 1692. One gentleman, Giles Corey, was pressed to death over a 2-day period. Elizabeth Howe was actually accused by my cousin, Ann Putnam Jr. How do you feel about Ann Putnam Jr.?
She's a troublemaker, for sure.
She is. Little Annie, troublemaker. So we took that knowledge and we were kind of like uncovering our ancestry kind of together. She was digging to her Howe lineage, and I was digging into it's actually the Gould family that ties me to the Putnam family. And I'll tell you, we kind of did it together, and we ended up doing a show called Forbidden History in Salem. And tell me like your perspective on working on the show with me for Forbidden History.
It was a very cool experience. It wasn't my first time doing television stuff, but I haven't done anything in television for years and years. So I felt very comfortable with that. But it was a whole other thing doing ritual work in front of the camera. And it was something very personal too, because it involved our personal ancestors. So it was a very public thing that everybody knows about this history, but it was a very intimate thing that we were doing with the ritual. And I was very grateful to be involved in it because I felt like that really was a lot of the reason why we met in the first place, was because there was that connection. And we were drawn there for a reason, I think, and especially to that place because we hadn't planned to go there when we first went to Salem that day. We kind of came upon it by accident, the Samuel Paris Foundation, which I guess you can talk more about in a minute. But it was a very interesting experience, and some things happened in those 2 days that were real eye openers for me too. Things that I hadn't experienced before.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the first time we actually decided to do. We called it an apology ritual, and where I read the letter that Ann Putnam Jr. wrote years after the Salem witch trials to apologize for her role in the Salem witch trials. And so that what the thing is, like, she wrote it, but she actually did not never like voice the apology out loud. It was actually read by the Reverend Green in church, for her to basically get back into the church because she was excommunicated. However, we decided to take that letter and read it out loud. We created like a sacred circle, at a sacred space at the Samuel Paris Foundation. And for those who don't know what that is, that's actually ground zero to the Salem witch trials. This is where Betty Paris, who was the first girl that was afflicted, uh, and also with Abigail Williams, who we know a lot from the Crucible. That's where the first affliction took place. And my cousin Ann Putnam Jr. actually was neighbors to Betty Paris, and she was the third girl to be afflicted by this unknown condition that was, I guess, caused by, according to them, by witchcraft. And so we went to this foundation. There's a lot of energy there. And we connected at first, the first time we did the ritual. Dana, who did we connect with? I think I remember communicating with Tituba, or definitely with one of the victims.
Yes, for me, Tituba was a huge, huge connection. I could just feel like some very strong emotion coming from there, and it was a very frenetic, almost like she was still, after all this time, feeling like she was responsible, and just that I can't even imagine how having that weigh on you for such an eternity would feel, feeling like you were responsible for all of that. And then George Burroughs was another one that I think we both felt there, which surprised us both. And neither one of us, I don't think you knew that he lived there before Samuel Paris, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, like when we were reading, there's a plaque outside of the Samuel Paris Foundation. I've known about Samuel Paris. I've talked about him for years, giving my
Yeah,
tours. I didn't put
yeah.
two and two together that the Reverend Burroughs also lived at that same location when he was Reverend of Danvers, or modern day Danvers.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense because that would be the parsonage, right? So it would
Right.
make sense for the parson to live there. Um, yeah, but so that was really interesting. I wasn't really sure what to expect, and I was honestly not really expecting to connect with Tituba, but she came through like loud and clear.
And for me, the connection was definitely Reverend Burroughs. And to tell you the backstory, the Putnam family actually uh, lent him money when he was the Reverend of, it was called Salem Village back in 1692. So he was the Reverend. He borrowed the money, and then he actually went to Maine, Wells, Maine, to, I guess, convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And he was brought back to the Salem witch trials by my cousin, Ann Putnam Jr., who had a vision of him being the ultimate witch. He was the devil himself, according to my cousin Ann Putnam Jr. And if you look at the backstory with the Putnam family and George Burroughs specifically, there was a lot of tension going on for years. So there was a reason why he was brought back and accused of being a witch and the devil, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
poor guy.
Poor guy, now. So Elizabeth Howe, what is I know about all the victims of the Salem witch trials by giving tours, but what about Elizabeth Howe? I know that you and I kind of were digging up information about her and who she was as a person. What do you think of Elizabeth Howe? Like, what was she like?
Well, I have, I mean, there's things I've read about her, and there are things that there are impressions that I have of her. I mean, and I think my impressions that I have of her really go along with what I've read about her. But she was a very independent woman. Her husband had gone blind at a fairly young age, and so she was really in charge of everything, that, their family farm, the business. Um, and She was one of these women who had a lot of power and control over the household money and everything. And I think that that was very hard for a lot of men at that time to really be able to deal with. They really didn't see women as, you know, they shouldn't have that kind of control. They're not the head of the family. The man is the head of the family. I think that there was probably a certain amount of resentment that she had to deal with when she had to work with the men in the community, because they would buy and sell crops and animals and things like that from each other all the time, I would imagine, and work with the neighbors. So I think that I feel that there was a certain amount of resentment about that, and I think that her husband was very supportive of her. I feel that he was very loving and very supportive and very grateful, and he had no issues with her, being doing things that he would traditionally do. And they had a good relationship. I feel like they had a very strong relationship. They relied on each other a lot, and he had a really big trust in her, and she was a strong woman.
What I also got from her, from reading through a lot of the documents from the Salem witch trials, that she was a little sassy as well. Like she would maybe say a comment that was a little, considered at the time kind of being outspoken for a woman. Did you
Yeah,
get that from her?
yeah. Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's all part and parcel, right? I mean, I think that you kind of have to have that sort of self-confidence if you're gonna get along in that world as a woman, right?
That's sort of like a recurring theme. Like the women that were accused of witchcraft, but they were all, of course, different personalities. You had Sarah Good, who was a town Baker woman, who was very outspoken. You had Bridget Bishop, who had kind of a sketchy past, but she also, all these people, of course, were not witches. But Elizabeth Howe, from my take on her, she was definitely more kind of sassy, like a strong woman. Because her husband was blind, she was controlling, like running the household. And the fact that she was accused of witchcraft was probably more based on her personality and probably the
Yeah.
property as well. I know that she had a beautiful home, and it seemed like a lot of the people that were accused had property that the Putnam family wanted.
Yeah, the house had a really quite large parcel of land in Ipswich, and uh, I'm sure that there were probably I know there was a lot of land disputes that happened amongst people involved with the witch trials. So I think that probably had something to do with it. But I think anytime there were things that people coveted, if they were accused and convicted as being a witch, then all their property would be taken. So there was impetus for people to make accusations, besides just hysteria.
And I have to agree with that. People ask me all the time, why did the Salem witch trials take place? And there's of course, multiple factors that are involved, but I do think property is one of them. And if you look at sort of the history of my family, the Putnam family, and also my family, the Gould family, and from originally from Portsmouth, Rhode Island, they had issues with land, and in fact, they were in a position of control where they, like Thomas Putnam, was someone that was like a constable, where he would look at the property, and he was responsible for a lot of the land throughout New England. So of course, like if they had a conflict with, say, a competing, like a neighbor, like Rebecca Nurse, who had a large piece of property, or Elizabeth Howe, or if they had a long-standing feud with our family, like the Gould family with Rebecca Nurse's mother, who was also accused of witchcraft by the Gould family 10 years before the Salem witch trials. So there's a lot of factors going on, and you have someone like
Yeah.
John Proctor, who had a tavern that was very successful, and it was competing with the Ingersoll Tavern. So there was a lot of jealousy was a factor. I think women being outspoken was a factor. Kind of like kind of wearing the pants. They didn't like that. The men
Yeah.
wanted to quiet the women. In fact, they created these crude contraptions for women for gossiping, that they would put on their faces to kind of like to publicly shame them for being outspoken. So I do think it's about misogyny. I do think it's about the fear of the unknown, like the Native Americans in the horizon in Maine and around there. And also there was smallpox, and there was also a famine. So there was a perfect storm of a lot of things going on in 1692 that came to what became the witch trials hysteria.
Yeah, and it seems like the witch trials that were happening over in Europe during the beginning of the century before, it kind of the way it traveled across Europe and then into the British Isles, and then it seemed to kind of correspond with when people were starting to migrate over to Massachusetts Bay Colony like time-wise. It seemed like it traveled through Europe and then to the British Isles and then to the New World, and that those attitudes came with them.
Yeah, I also think that, getting back to what we did with Forbidden History, I think that a lot of that tension and what happened in 1692 has left a psychic stain on the land. And people ask me,
Absolutely.
how can the spirits be from 300 years ago still be sticking around? I'm like, well, they're going to stick around if they have unfinished business. And these people, these innocent men and women, have unfinished business. So when we did Forbidden History, our job really was to apologize to the victims on behalf of my cousin Ann Putnam Jr. And you accepted on behalf of Elizabeth Howe. And when we did this show, kind of tied into what this is about, which is haunted hotels. We actually, our ground base was the Hawthorne Hotel. And we went out to the Samuel Parris Foundation to do this ritual. And so tell us about like the time we did it for Forbidden History. It was a little different than the first time we actually did the ritual, right?
Yeah, it was. The second time, I was the spirits that I was connecting with were completely different. I felt like Tituba really was kind of there, maybe as just an observer, but I think that that release from all of that anxiety and stuff kind of happened after our first ritual, because I really felt that toned down a lot the first time we did it, um, if not completely. But I really was feeling Ann Putnam Jr. there the second time in a big way. And Elizabeth Howe, although there wasn't a whole lot of, there wasn't anxiety or any angst or anything like that, like there was with Tituba. It was more being there as a witness and accepting that, being there with me to accept that apology. Like I felt like she was there with me that second time on a really personal level. The whole thing the second time around was more emotional for me, and I think that was because the first time was there, all of that energy was there from Tituba, so I didn't really kind of focus on myself so much or my feelings about it. But the second time that when we did it for the cameras, um, I was really able to settle into it more because I didn't have that high anxiety feeling. And I really, it felt very emotional to me, and I almost burst into tears at the end. It was, um, it felt very personal.
I felt the same way, and there was a moment where I read the letter and I was crying as I was reading the letter from Ann Putnam Jr. And you kind of paused and took a deep breath, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's totally gonna reject me right now. Like,
No.
because I think what we said in the show that I'm like, do you accept my apology from Ann Putnam Jr.? And you kind of paused and you said, on behalf of my ancestor Elizabeth Howe, I accept your apology. And I felt like like something lifted off me, like the weight lifted off me from that moment.
Yeah, I definitely the pause was because I was kinda choked up. I had to take a breath so that I wouldn't just go, "Ah," and do an ugly cry in front of the camera, you know?
Whatever. I also wanted to do, Dana, is I wanted to go into sort of like the backstory of making that show, because it was in January of 2020, so this is before the
Yeah.
COVID hit, and we were freezing, and we were outside a lot. So our home base was the Hawthorne Hotel, and then we would go out into the field. There was a lot that you shot that was cut, but it was excellent footage. But I just think that for whatever reason, they ended up cutting it. But tell us about the whole period where you were like walking forward and the cameraman was kind of like walking backwards in the middle of the woods, and this is like late at night.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was really crazy because I couldn't see a thing because they had the light on the camera because it was dark. We were in the woods, no kind of lighting except the light coming from this camera, which was square on my face. So I'm trying to walk at kind of the same speed as the camera, and the guy with the camera is walking backwards, being guided by one of the producers, and I'm just trying to like not, hit a root and fall on my face because we were going through this like crazy windy trail with all these roots and stuff. It wasn't as if it was even paved or even, gravel or anything. It was just a dirt trail with a lot of roots and stuff and things to trip on. But it was really interesting, just trying to kind of coordinate that with thinking about the answers to the questions that I was being given. Like I had to focus on. It was hard to focus on both things at the same time, but
Yeah,
it was really fun.
yeah, I was behind the producer, so I was kind of like finding the path, making sure that you don't trip. I was like, okay, like
Thank you.
I would point out things that were potential trip hazards. And I also, like, while I was doing that though, Dana, I kept seeing shadow figures in the woods too. Like there was stuff going on around us as well. And also when we did the apology ritual, I mean the animals were just
Yeah.
off the hook. Like the birds were flying, squirrels were coming up to us. Like when you do ritual, do you find that animals respond to the ritual?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. I get a lot of spiritual message through animals, whether it is just something that an animal does that's very unusual, and so it catches your attention, or if they do something in particular during an exact part of the ritual that you can really see the connection. Like there's all kinds, and then there's just certain animals have kind of certain spiritual meaning that a lot of people really resonate with, and sometimes it even could just be a personal resonance that I have with an animal, and they just appear at a certain time, and there's so many messages that you can get from animals. And yes, they definitely do respond around magic stuff. Absolutely.
The first time we did the apology ritual at the Samuel Paris Foundation, Dana, I was surrounded by kind of like it's called a murder of crows, and they just
Yeah.
kind of came around me. This is when I got off the train in Salem to go meet up with you, and I'll tell you, like the birds kind of led us to the Samuel Paris Foundation because we were originally going to do it at the Rebecca Nurse homestead or the cemetery in there, but we wanted to kind of like let our spirits guides guide us to where we wanted to go.
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually a really cool experience, kind of just taking it one step at a time. And the first place we thought about doing it at one of the memorials in Salem, but then we were like, no, too many people around, this is kind of too personal and intimate, we don't really want to have people watching. And so then we thought about Rebecca Nurse because you have some Putnam family relatives in that cemetery. Yes, a couple.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, okay, so if we go there, chances are pretty good it will be quietish. So we pulled in and it wasn't open, and we are like, well, maybe the caretakers here, maybe they'll let us still just go out, just the two of us. And she was there and she did say, normally I would say yes, but they're doing some construction work back there, fixing things up, and there's some big machines. And so I can't let you head back to the cemetery. So we're like, okay. And then we kind of drove around a little bit, and you were talking about this place and that place, and you mentioned Samuel Paris Foundation, but you weren't sure where it was. So we must have driven by it a couple of times and didn't notice. And I pulled over and I took out my trusty phone and I Googled it because I'm like, well, surely it's got to be some, an article about it or something. And I did manage to find the address, and it was right around the corner from where we were. And when we got there, I was like, I stepped out before we even went down the pathway to the back where the foundation is. I remember like thinking, oh my God, this is the place. Like we were led here. The reasons why we couldn't go to those other places were because this is where we had to be. I really felt that.
I felt that too, and also it was kind of weird when you pulled over to do the Google search. We were actually right next to the Israel Putnam house, which is also
Yes.
the ancestors of my family. That's where they were born and raised. So it wasn't actually Thomas Putnam who was the father of Ann Putnam Jr. It was actually his brother that owned that house, and so there was another Putnam connection that wasn't actually bad. He actually fought the Salem witch trials and was worried about his
Yeah.
safety because of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a very emotional. The first time we did it, I felt kind of elated and kind of high on life, and I felt like it really worked. The second time we did it for the camera, I felt that there was definitely the presence of Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Howe in our circle, plus other people as well. I think Thomas Putnam was coming into the circle as well.
Yeah.
And I was like, is that your cat in the background?
Oh, my husband bringing me a snack.
Oh. I thought I saw a cat in the background,
Yeah,
but
no,
that's really
he was
sweet.
trying to be sneaky.
So, Dana, like, with that said, like we did have something happen during the filming of Forbidden History that didn't make the cut, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We were filming on the third day. We were in downtown Salem, actually right outside of the hotel where I had my experience that was featured on Paranormal Night Shift, and you and I were walking, and what happened next?
Well, so they were at the time they were filming you, and you were talking about your experience at that bookstore, um, and with the Hat Man, and you started getting very agitated, and it was very strange because you kept like looking past and seeing people and you're like, oh, there's people walking by and I don't want to talk about this in front of them, and you're like, it seemed like every little thing started irritate, like everything started irritating you, every little, and you were getting more and more and more, and you started like getting snappy with the camera guy, and um I felt like you were at any point you were just going to be like, I'm out of here, and you were just going to like leave. That's how agitated you got. And I remember thinking like, this is really weird because Sam wasn't like this, minutes ago, and all of a sudden this complete flip of his personality. So I was like, this is not Sam. So we were walking away from, because I think you had said you wanted to move away from that area, and go somewhere where there were less people. And we were kind of walking away from where all this was going down. And I hung back slightly from you guys, you and the camera guy and the producers. And I put up a Christal Shield of Protection around us because I felt like there was something negative that was definitely coming at you. Like it was obvious to me that it wasn't you that was agitated, that something was affecting you. So I put that Christal Shield up around all of us. And you seemed to come out of it pretty quickly after that. And then you described how you felt like you were, this thing was getting inside you and it was like trying to take you over.
Right. Yeah, I was channeling, and to kind of give you some backstory with the channeling, I had an experience at the hotel. So the bookstore is called Wicked Good Books, and it's on Essex Street. Right next to it is the hotel
Right.
right next to it is the hotel that I worked at the overnight shift for, and I had an experience 2 years ago with a man wearing a hat at the hotel. So I was working the overnight shift. I first spotted like a black mass on the first floor when it was like around 3 in the morning working the overnight shift. And then I saw the black mass go into the elevator, and the elevator went down to the basement. Now, this hotel is in a historic building, but it's actually not a historic hotel. So it's actually a new hotel that was built in an old department store that was on Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts. So I actually followed that black mass down to the basement, and that's when I heard like a moaning noise, like oh, like someone was in intense pain, and then I heard metal banging as well. I thought perhaps that it was either the bookstore or the gift shop that was right next to the hotel that I was having that experience with, and so I go upstairs and look out into the window, and I see what still kind of haunts me now was a man wearing a hat. It was like a black shadow with red glowing eyes. And I will never forget that. It said it was communicating with me telepathically. He like looked at me and he said, "Can you see me?" And I telepathically told him, "Yes, I can see you." And we had that connection, almost like I was frozen at that moment. And he's been stalking me ever since. So I've had multiple encounters with that entity, my first impression of that entity was that perhaps it was Thomas Putnam. Now, we've done an Estes method session, Dana. What do you think that entity is?
Um, my feeling is that it is like a psychotic break splinter part of Thomas Putnam's personality. So it's not like Thomas Putnam. It's like at some point what he was involved with. He had a like a psychotic break or something, and he was just because mentally, emotionally, he had to kind of separate himself from all of that because I can't even imagine trying to live with everything that was going on and knowing that you had a huge amount of responsibility for the deaths of all these people. And I think, our brains actually section certain things off if it's too much trauma to handle. And I think that's the energy that was left behind from him, that darkness, that peace that was his psyche was trying to compartmentalize all of that negative stuff inside.
I have to agree with you. I'm not 100% sure that it's actually Thomas Putnam. When we did the Estes
Yeah,
method
maybe
at,
not
at the
specifically
Hawthorne
him, but
Hotel, and I want to play a clip from the Estes method. We connected strongly with Giles Corey, and I just kind of choked a little bit while I was thinking about it because I started having chest pains and feeling like I couldn't breathe when we were connecting with Giles Corey. So it could have
yeah,
been actually Corey, who was the guy that was pressed to death over a 2-day period. He would have a lot of guilt. He would have a lot of anger. He supposedly actually cursed Salem in 1692, like while he was being pressed to death. And I would
yeah.
curse Salem too if I had rocks on top of me and I was killed that way. And guess who came up with the idea for that form of execution?
Thomas Putnam.
Well, kind of, yeah. So actually, Ann Putnam Jr., my cousin, had a dream of Giles Corey being pressed to death, and she told her father Thomas Putnam, who told the
Wow.
magistrates. So she had a dream that became his ultimate demise. That's a
Wow.
lot of that's a lot of stuff to be tied to. Like
Yeah.
the idea that Giles was pressed to death is kind of like unfathomable, but the fact that Ann Putnam Jr. came up with that idea is even worse. And so, if anyone would have a vendetta against my family, it would be Giles Corey. And according to legend, Giles Corey has actually cursed Salem and the Sheriff George Corwin. And he said, I curse you, referring to Sheriff George Corwin, and I curse Salem. Uh, I have never seen Giles Corey, but I've heard people talk about experiences around the Howard Street Cemetery, which is where he was pressed to death.
Yeah.
And according to multiple people's accounts, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter, The House of Seven Gables, that he called him the wizard. If Giles Corey is spotted, something bad will happen to Salem. So he was spotted right before the Great Fire of 1914 in Salem, which decimated about 70% of the town by multiple people. So I do think Giles Corey is sticking around, and I do think that perhaps that entity is somehow tied to Giles Corey. Now, is it Thomas Putnam? Yeah, it could be Thomas Putnam, or it could be Giles Corey. And Giles,
Honestly, Sam, I don't see why, like, to me, that negative, that huge negativity that came from multiple people, that energy could have all kind of, like, if it wasn't individuals but just splinters, they could have been drawn together to kind of become one piece, almost becoming a whole together from
like
all of the, but it's just that massive negativity like that, because it's such a huge dark imprint.
I agree with you, and that's actually a really interesting theory because a lot of times, if you look at sort of like the backstory to that, it started as like a black cloud, like a black smoke that was going through the hotel, and then it kind of got stronger and stronger. And you and I did an Estes method session in Salem, and we're communicating with the entity, and it was saying it was in pain. We asked, "Are you human?" It didn't respond, but it also said, like you asked, "What do you want from Sam?" And what did it say?
Oh my gosh.
It said
I don't
ener-
remember.
it was energy. It wanted my energy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah. So I think
Well, and because you knew that it was there, so it, that definitely was feeding it for sure.
so. I think that getting back to the so when you put up the crystal shield outside of the bookstore, when I was kind of channeling the spirit, I think it was probably that entity, whether it was Thomas Putnam or Giles Corey or
Yeah.
Splinter or all the negativity associated with the Salem witch trials, kind of put together to create this monster. Uh, what happened? So we were walking around talking about the history of the Salem witch trials, and you found something on your leg the following day, right?
Yes, I did. So the next morning, I was just, going around getting my son ready to go to school and everything. And every time I like bent down to pick something up and like put it in a school bag or whatever, I was like, ow, the back of what's going on with the back of my knee? I just felt like it's like sharp pain every time I bent my leg to, do stuff. And when I got in the car and sat in the car and the my inside of my knee hit the seat when I sat down, I was like, ow, that really hurts. So I was, taking him to school and stuff. So when I got home, the first thing I did was I took off my pants to see like what's going on with the back of my knee. And there was there were two cuts like right is that is that back right behind your knee where it's like really sensitive. I
Right.
had two little cuts there that were clearly fresh. They had a little bit of a scab. It was like, well, from an injury that just happened yesterday. That's the kind of scab that was on it. It was obviously new. And there was like this almost half moon of bruise, a mottled bruise around there. And I looked at it and I turned on the camera on my phone to put it under my leg and get a better look at it because it was really hard to see on the back. And I took some pictures of it and I was like, holy crap, that's a bite mark. And I sent the pictures to you and I was like, Sam, I know I would have noticed if something like this happened to me physically. There's no way that I would have not felt this happen, especially not when it breaks the skin and it's in such a sensitive spot. But and so we talked about it because I was like, do you think this could possibly be from yesterday? And I think in the end we both agreed that it was likely when I was putting up the crystal shield and it was getting pushed away from you, it retaliated and came at me and bit me as I was pushing it away from out of our sphere, and it really resonated that that's what that was because there's like it was absolutely a bite mark, absolutely.
And I strongly agree with you. And I remember we were talking about it, and we actually sent the photo to the producers. They were British, and I think they were like terrified that because
Yeah.
we're trying to show them, hey, like look, Dana got bit on set, and like that's what was going on. And we sent the pictures, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry that you were injured
Yeah.
on. No, there was an
No, we're
entity
not.
that.
It's like, no, we're not gonna sue you. It's okay. No, it's just nothing like that. Just wanted to
And
show them.
and in some ways, like I've been attacked, or I haven't never been bit before, but I've been scratched multiple times. Now, there's another hotel in Salem that is where it's called the Merchant now, but there's this it's beautiful boutique hotel that was formerly the most haunted hotel in Salem, or haunted building in Salem. It's called the Joshua Ward House. Now, why would that house be so haunted? Well, back in 1692, that's where the Sheriff George Corwin lived, and he that property was waterfront property back in 1692. The house that's there now that was turned into the Merchant, of course, is long gone, but the property has a mark on it, like a stain on it. And I remember going back to that house when it was kind of it was creepy and all closed down and nobody was wanted to even stay in that building, walking up to it to get a close look into the windows to see what was inside, and I got scratched on my chest. And the kind of you've been bit by something paranormal, I've been scratched. For me, it didn't feel like a scratch because a scratch, if you get, say your cat scratches you, you can definitely feel that scratching you. But for me,
Yeah.
it felt like kind of like a burning sensation on my chest. I didn't look at my chest until after the tour that I was giving, and I lifted my chest up, and there were kind of like 3 raised marks on my chest that were not, the blood was not like flowing from it. It was just like really red and raised. Was yours bloody? Like did it actually draw blood?
Oh yeah, I had scabs. The two incisor teeth marks that broke the skin. Yeah, there were scabs on there. The rest was just bruising, but the two incisor teeth marks were absolutely broke the skin. Yeah,
Now, did it, Dana? Did it take a while for it to go away? Because my
yeah.
scratch went away pretty fast.
I know it took a while. It took a while. It was there for quite a while. I was like checking it every day. I the thing that maybe interested me the most about it was that it didn't scare me. Because if somebody had said to you, if you get bit in the back of the leg by a, you know, a some kind of dark paranormal entity, would it freak you out? I would have been like, hell yes, of course it would freak me out. But I think the reason why it didn't was because it was physical proof that that crystal shield was very powerful,
Yeah,
you know,
it was like validation.
and
It was also
yeah,
your first like paranormal battle wound
it
too. And
was, it was,
I remember you saying that, and I'm like that's a good way to look at it because if I got bit,
yeah.
I would probably be terrified.
Yeah, I don't know. It was funny. I mean, I guess like you said, it just raised my confidence in my protection skills. So in that case, I feel stronger, not diminished by it. So I take that as a good thing.
So getting back to the merchant, or what was the Joshua Ward house, like that hotel is right on the corner, so it's right by a Dunkin' Donuts. So people are like, "Where is it?" It's like it's right by a Dunkin' Donuts on Washington Street in Salem, Massachusetts. The reason why it would be haunted is because actually Sheriff George Corwin was the one that would go and retrieve the property during the Salem witch trials. So he would go out to like Elizabeth Howe or like to Rebecca Nurse and take their property back. He was the gentleman that was standing over Giles Corey with a cane, like while Giles Corey was being pressed to death and putting the tongue back in. Now, the sheriff dies of an ailment, like a blood related ailment, in his early 30s after the Salem witch trials. And because he have his role in the Salem witch trials, the people wanted to rip him into pieces. So they had to hide his body in the basement of that what was his house on Washington Street, and then give him a proper burial later in life after sort of like the backlash related to the Salem witch trials took place. So that
Wow.
hotel be haunted by the spirit of Sheriff George Corwin, and it makes complete sense because that was his property.
Yeah, yeah. And, I guess that was his original burial place, really, for all intents and purposes, for a period of time, right?
Yeah, and people report feeling like a choking sensation, and I know that he was sadistic to the victims and also to the people that were accused of witchcraft. So he was a bad guy. But if you really look at how his role was, he was the nephew of one of the magistrates who were the judges during the Salem witch trials. So he was kind of carrying out orders, and I always kind of view him as like a Barney Fife of the Salem witch trials. He was kind of like, okay, I'll do it. He followed blindly these crazy rules and crazy laws that
Yeah.
were in place and really tortured these innocent men and women.
Yeah, well, and regardless of whether he was just blindly following someone else's orders or not, he still did it.
Exactly. He still did it, and
It's
he died a very young, painful death. They see that there's a curse associated with Sheriff George Corwin as well. And when Giles Corey said, "I cursed you and I cursed Salem," everybody that's been the sheriff of Salem since the George Corwin has died of something blood related. So whether heart attacks, strokes, even my predecessor Robert Cahill, who was kind of like the ghostwriter of Salem in his 60s and 70s, he became sort of like the honorary sheriff of Salem just to kind of prove the point wrong. Well, he has a heart attack not long after. So I will never be that sheriff of
ta-
Salem.
yeah, take care of yourself, Sam.
I know. I'm like, okay, but I mean, Dana, like, if you were me and you had sort of like this passion to tell the stories of the Salem witch trials victims and you wanted to make amends for your relatives, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I think you're doing what I would do. You're voicing the reality of what happened. That you're a big advocate of the history. Um, I think that I mean, there's a lot of tour guides there that really just kind of want to go with the spookiest stories that they can because that's what they think people are looking for. Probably a lot of people who come to Salem are, but there's very many people also who really want the real historical accurate information which you give, and you know wanting to do the ritual and having that also be sort of publicly televised as well. You're really being an advocate and speaking for all of the people involved, from the victims, but also the perpetrators, because I mean, I'm sure that there was a lot of regret and a lot of guilt and a lot of self-loathing on the side of the people who were responsible, even if at the time they felt like they were really doing the right thing. But there's times were so different then, and beliefs were so different then, and I think it's you also bring light to that as well. You talk about why they believed the things they believed, and what could have, why would spectral evidence be a thing, and but you're an advocate of the time and place, reasons why a lot of those things would have gone on, even though they seem nutty from our point of view, looking back at it. But at the time, things were very different. So, you have to be kind of even handed that way. Yes, these people were victims, but in a lot of senses, the people that accused them were victims in other ways themselves, just of circumstance, of time, of place.
So Dana, you're kind of someone that I like to know in many because you not only are you a practicing witch, but you also have ties to Elizabeth Howe. And I'm always kind of like curious what people who actually related to the victims of the Salem witch trials and are also witches, like how do they feel about Salem in general? Because I've heard things like, oh, you're kind of making light of the tragedy that happened 300 years ago in 1692. And you and I both have personal ties to Salem in 1692. What do you think about Salem?
Um, I think there's a lot of kind of cheesy stuff there, if you will, but on the one hand, I think that stuff is also fun. And I think that it really kind of gives it's a place where people who feel like misfits can go, like, and they feel like they're embraced there, they can express themselves there. And I think that that's actually a really wonderful thing. I don't think that anybody there is really trying to make light of the deaths of those people. Um, but I think the whole witchcraft kind of industry that's there is kind of separate. I mean, the Salem people in 1692 were accused of being witches, um, but that what the kind of witchery that they were being accused of was something completely different than what we know witchcraft as today. And I think that probably a lot of those people back then were witches in the way that we are now, in terms of working with natural energies, and like folk remedies, folk healing, using herbs for things, putting decorating eggs in the spring and putting them in the field for the crops. Like, all that stuff is a declaration of intention and working with the natural energies of the universe. And I'm sure that they did a lot of that. That stuff was very common, but that wasn't seen as witchcraft then, even though we know it to be witchcraft now. Um, so I think that they actually were witches, but not the way that they were, defining witch at that time was that they were making a pact with Satan and doing Satan's work. And modern day witches don't even believe in hell or Satan. It has nothing to do with any of that. But I I think that, given that people came to America at that point from Europe, they were trying to get away from religious persecution in a lot of cases. So I found it that very sad that they would come here and then become religiously persecuted
Right.
after trying to get away from that. Um, that's troubling. But I love that now it's a place where people can go and do and express their religious beliefs in a free way. So yes, for some people that's Wiccan, witchcraft, and other forms of pagan worship. And um, so I think that it's kind of a victory in that sense that that's happening there, that it's so free and open in that way. Um, I could do without some of the cheesier elements, but at the same time, I think it's great that people can have fun and express themselves and um, embrace that side that we all love when we're kids, right? Halloween, getting to dress up as something scary and imagining that you have magic powers. And I love that there's a place where people can just go and embrace that at any age. I think it's fantastic.
The whole like witch on broom stereotype is definitely a part of Salem's sort of like branding, but I do think that there's so much more. There's people like myself that are really passionate about telling the history correctly, and then also really likes the idea that Salem embraces those who have been traditionally marginalized by the status quo, and those are the ones like
Absolutely.
back in 1692, the women, the people that were different, were the ones that were accused and executed of witchcraft.
Yeah.
So by kind of like flipping the script and doing a
Yeah.
pivot, Salem has become a place to embrace the others, the ones that were
Yeah.
traditionally persecuted.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's wonderful. I do.
All right, so Dana, this is Haunted Hotels with Sam Baltrusis. If you wanted to stay at a haunted hotel in Salem, which one would you recommend?
The Hawthorne, I think.
And why would you recommend the Hawthorne Hotel?
Well, it's a beautiful hotel. It has a lot of great history. It's right there in the middle of everything, so it's a great place to kind of go out and explore Salem from. It's an easy walk to everything from there. Um, and maybe you'll get to experience a little paranormal activity.
So the whole backstory with the Hawthorne Hotel, there's what is known as the library, which is all the way downstairs. So it's like an event space. I had an encounter with like a shadow figure, and it was, like while I was doing a lecture in the library at the Hawthorne Hotel, and I heard a man kind of like yell in my ear because I'm clairvoyant. I can hear what they were saying, and he was saying "ba ba," and he was saying "bar" in New England speak. So apparently, the ghost wanted the bar, and then also I had an experience. So I investigated the sixth floor, and when I was doing an investigation with Amy Bruni and Adam Berry for their strange escapes, and I heard a distinct male voice and a woman have a conversation in the haunted suite on the sixth floor. And also, Dana, when we did the Estes method, I was on the fifth floor at the Hawthorne Hotel, and we actually had a paranormal experience while we were doing the Estes method too. We were talking to the spirit, and we heard a door literally open and slam while we were there. And we had not only were you not you weren't in the room, you were doing it remotely, but we had Danny Perez and Lauren Perez right behind me, and they heard that opening and closing door as well. So I
Yeah.
do think that anywhere you go at the Hawthorne Hotel, you probably will have a room with a boo. It's very haunted. So, Dana, if people want more information, where would they go?
I'm on Twitter. I clearly need to set up a website or something like that with more. It's funny because I'm getting more and more into this side of things. I'm an animator. That's my mundane career. I'm an animator, and so I've had stuff up in the past, and I have a Facebook page for my animation studio. But I think now the more I get into doing paranormal stuff and mediumship work, I need to do something on that as well. So I'll have to set something up. But I am on Twitter. Um, Dana Masson, or it's at Killer Jellybean, which is the word Killer Jellybean without the vowels. That's essentially how you spell it.
And, and also, Dana and I do a lot of work together. We actually just recently shot a documentary. So in addition to Forbidden History, we shot a documentary together. And I'm finding that when we work together on the Estes method, Dana, like we're really doing some great work.
Yeah, it really it shocked me like you wouldn't believe the first time we did it. I wasn't even sure I truly believed that you couldn't actually hear what I was saying, because the communication was so direct back and forth. And I kept on bringing things up that would match up with what you would say next, and vice versa. It was just crazy. And I remember Danny and Lauren, when they were in the room there with you at the hotel, they were just like shocked beyond belief that so much of it was just so clear. And I remember thinking, the second time we did it, I was like, I wonder if this is going to be anywhere near as clear as the first one was, thinking, maybe that was just a fluke, but it was, and it continues to be when we do it. So it's really fascinating to me that it flows so well.
And we, in addition to the documentary and Forbidden History, we also did the Estes method on the Dark Zone at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast, and I thought that was really powerful as well. And I remember because we both are like, we watched the Dark Zone, which is like a live streaming event at various haunted locations, and I'll tell you, people were like either blown away or like, "Hey, was that real? Like that looked like that was scripted." And you and I both know it's real, but the people watching, most people think they get it, and they get how intense it was, and also the fact that I think that you and I channel each other while we're doing this. So when I have the blindfold on and the earphones on, and I like you're communicating with me, I can actually see you at the back of my head, and I see you like in front of like.
That's because that's where I am. I'm right at the back of your head.
And I'm like, and so Dana, like the internal version of you're sitting in front of like a crystal ball, and I think the one time you were in front of a crystal ball, but you were like crystal ball, and you're in the back of my head, and I'm like, that's Dana, and you're like talking to me, and I can actually see you in the back of my head, which is kind of weird.
I think that's cool.
It is
cool.
Think
that's really cool.
And that means that we're connected. I wouldn't be surprised, Dana, if we find out that we're related. I
wouldn't be surprised either.
Because I think that we keep going next level, and it's like, oh my gosh. And so I'm kind of curious as we move forward if we find that there are ties to our families.
Yeah, I know that going down through the family tree of the Howes, I see lots of other family names that, intermarry. And a number of them are names of people who, you're like, well, how could the Howe family, anyone in the Howe family ever, think that it was okay to marry someone in the Paris family or someone in the Putnam family, but over time, I guess, those things kind of go away, and families just keep multiplying. But I've seen some of those names in the Howe family tree that surprised me. But
well, I mean, for me personally, I not only am I tied to the Putnam family, but I'm also tied to Lizzie Borden as well. And that shocked the heck out of me. I'm like, how can I be tied to not only the Putnam family from 1692, but also Lizzie Borden? But there's actually one woman that ties us all together, and she was actually a child of another murder that happened in the 1600s. So we'll talk more about this. We have a lot of cases, Dana, for you and I to work on in the future.
I can't wait. I'm very excited.
And to get for more information about our experiences out in the field, my new book, Haunted Hotels of New England, talks about the Estes method session that Dana and I had, and also the apology ritual that we did at the Samuel Paris Foundation. So thank you guys for joining Dana and myself on the Salem edition of Haunted Hotels with Sam Baltrusis. I hope you all have a wonderful night, and when you check in, make sure you check out of the hotel. Thank you, and have a great night.
Paranormal Network.